Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Obviously, of course, we will spend some time later this week talking about the shooting in Florida, and that, of course, is of some concern. We have guests in studio both hours, so we're probably not going to spend a lot of time talking about what has taken place in Florida. We'll leave that for our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dice will be with us. We'll also have some other guests, so we'll probably postpone some of that. But again, lots of questions that always surface at this time. First of all, there's always the rush to claim that gun control would make a difference. The best example I can give that counters that is that a while back there was an assertion by Senator Marco Rubio that gun control laws would not have prevented any of the mass shootings. That was investigated, interestingly enough, by Glenn Kessler, hardly an NRA apologist, for the Washington Post, and concluded that was true. So, of course, we can spend some time, as we will probably tomorrow, talking about the issue of gun control. But even so, that doesn't mean there are things we can't do. A piece that I'll post tomorrow by David French, I think, puts it very well. When policies fail, people can and should rise to the occasion. And he points out in this piece that we'll post tomorrow that since Columbine, we have seen warning signs time and time again. And with this shooter in Florida, did we not see quite a number of those? First example, there was a YouTube blogger that noticed that this individual had put in his comments section, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." He notified the FBI. The FBI talked to him. The FBI checked it out. And in a city which has been named in the past one of the safest cities in Florida, of course, we've had the shooting yesterday. So we will come back to this topic, but there are some issues that certainly we like to talk about here on Point of View. And so we'll postpone some of the conversation about the shooting until tomorrow when we have our weekend edition and get full coverage then. In studio with me today is a good friend, Carol Sewell. Matter of fact, ran into her at an event a while back, and she said, "I've got a new book out. I'm ready to come in studio again." So I already started to schedule her, and I thought, every time I've interviewed Carol, I've also thought of another friend, Tom DeWeese, who we've interviewed, and these individuals are usually singing off the same song sheet, so I thought we'd put the two of them together, Carol in studio, Tom by phone. And Carol, if you're not familiar, is with Generation to Generation, an organization she founded, a graduate of Oklahoma City University, and really tries to help people understand government systems. Author of such books as My Kids Belong to Who? What Were They Thinking? One on government oversight and individual rights, and Gatekeeper 101. Just a couple of her books. Carol, it's always great to have you in studio with us.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here with you, Kerby.
And it was fun to kind of connect you up with Tom DeWeese. I guess you've talked off air, but Tom DeWeese certainly no stranger to us as well. He was on a number of months ago talking about all sorts of issues that are of concern in terms of individual liberty. And he is really a leading advocate for liberty and free enterprise, private property rights, back to basics education and the rest, American sovereignty, the founder and president of the American Policy Center, and, of course, the editor of the DeWeese Report. And, Tom, thank you for joining us as well.
Hey, Kerby, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
You know, last time we had you on, we talked about Agenda 21. We've talked about globalism. We've talked about the concerns of what's happening in the schools. We've talked about the concerns of how many individuals have bought into this idea of sustainability. as we get into this, we're going to talk a lot about the solutions. But for a minute, let's talk about the problem, because there's still a lot of Christians and a lot of well-meaning people that think, well, we just need to pass some of these laws and we need to have a globalist perspective. And you've been warning us about that for decades, haven't you?
Well, yeah. What we're really working here, I mean, when they introduced Agenda 21 in 1992, over and over again, they said it was a comprehensive blueprint for reorganizing human society. I mean, that is an incredible statement. To reorganize human society to what? And we have been watching them as they've been doing this. They are molding us all together. Individuality is being destroyed. Free enterprise is a target. Private property is a target. Now we hear private property ownership is racism. And so these are all tools used to just put us all, we're all going to become kind of Stepford wives here. You know, we all walk in lockstep to whatever orders we're told. That's the reorganization of human society they're talking about, and we're seeing it pop up in every aspect of our lives.
You know, Carol, one of the things I know that concerns you is what's going on in the schools, because here's a good illustration. One of my co-hosts actually had a granddaughter, and they're driving down the road, and they see that this man is cutting down some trees, and this young granddaughter says, well, he's a bad man. And so they're trying to explain that, well, no, if you cut down the trees, there'll be a place for the houses, and this is a really good idea. And she says, well, he's a bad man, and if you agree with him, you're a bad person, and didn't talk to them the rest of the day. Now, where did that little grade school girl get that idea? In the public schools, right?
That's right. That's right. That's what they're teaching.
Yes.
So all these little environmentalists are growing up, and they believe the lies that they're being fed on a daily basis.
And again, sustainability sounds like a good idea. Mm-hmm. Who's against sustainability? We're for being good stewards of the planet. But the problem is that if indeed you raise young people up with the idea that we're in the midst of this catastrophe, global climate change is about to unfold on us, we need to reduce the population, we need sustainability, you can see the kind of policies you're going to have in the various school districts as well as ultimately in the various legislatures, right?
That's right. As they grow up, well, we see the end result in college as what we've been seeing in the different protests and when you interview them, what they say, well, they didn't just go to college and that just happened to them. They've been prepared all along the way, from kindergarten all the way up through public school. So they've never learned how to think for themselves. They just soak up like a sponge all this garbage that they're being taught, and then they go to college, and then they fall in lockstep with that. And those who don't suffer consequences. But, Jesus called us to be warriors, to stand firm in the faith. And so we do have a lot of college students that are doing that. We don't hear about them that much, but they are there, and they will make a difference.
Tom, talk about how these ideas go into the schools, because oftentimes when we talk with you, people say, well, I really appreciate Tom standing up against the United Nations, but what can I do? I want, by the time this program is over, for people to realize they can get involved in their local school districts, but the first step is to find out what's actually being taught in some of the classrooms and what's been actually making their way into some of the textbooks, don't you think?
Absolutely. This all really began to get really jazzed up when Bill Clinton got elected. And, of course, Jimmy Carter is the one who put together the Federal Department of Education. Up till then, education was run basically on a local level. You have local elected school boards and so forth still. They used to make all the decisions. Now these decisions are handed down to them by the Federal Department of Education. And there's just one program after another that are focusing not on academics. They are focusing on attitudes, values, and beliefs. And you may have heard programs we're talking about. We're going to put computers in the classroom so that if you have a child that's a little slower, we can put a special program just together for them so that they can catch up with everybody else. And they begin to look at it, you find out those computers are indoctrinating, not teaching.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate and discussion about transgender issues will continue because of a transgender ideology that is developed that is actually harmful to kids. That is one of the conclusions of the book by Ryan Anderson with the creative title When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The transgender ideology promotes the opportunity for children to change their gender with surgery and drugs, and parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Ryan Anderson counters that the best studies of gender dysphoria have found that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. He goes on to document that even children going through transitioning treatment still have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts compared to the general population. He reminds us that we should be tolerant and loving towards children and adults who struggle with their gender identity. But we should also be aware of the potential harm when transgender identity is normalized. Unfortunately, we are living in a world where transgender activists want more than tolerance and kindness. They demand affirmation. We aren't allowed to question whether using medical treatments to aid in transgender transformation is positive for children. In his new book, Ryan Anderson shows that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality. As he puts it, biology isn't bigotry. I hope the American people will trust the best scientific evidence and not reject it in favor of the transgender ideology. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13, Samson. In theaters February 16th. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, since calls are already coming in, 1-800-351-1212. Get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. Carol Sewell with us in studio, Tom DeWeese by phone. And let me just mention, we have links to both of their websites. We're going to spend a fair amount of time later on talking about those as well. But Carol, let me come to you, because sometimes when we talk about these big issues, whether it's Goals 2000, whether it's UN treaties or all sorts of things, people go, well, there's nothing I can do. Well, there's a lot you can do in your local school district. And one of the articles, or actually books that you have, which is called My Kids Belong to Who? ? And that's the problem. Right now, we are supposed to have this idea of a loco parentis. That is, that the school district has our kids, but they're supposed to be our representatives. Somehow, when we pay our tax dollars, they think they own the kids. And that's the first problem, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We forget that our children are our responsibility, that in Genesis 1-3, God set up the order and was very explicit that we are to teach our children. That's our responsibility. But with public education, we've been indoctrinated to believing that we can have some local control when, if we're not paying for it, we have no control. Because once they get our money, it's their money, and they kick us to the curb, and they teach them and indoctrinate them according to their ideologies. And it is not in our children's favor. So in My Kids Belong to Who, I'm just trying to show people the history and how from the garden, God said this. And so education progressed this way, this way, this way. And until here we are now. And so it's going to require, because we've gotten very, I don't want to say lazy, but convenience oriented, where it's more convenient to let the schools or the churches do the things that we are responsible for doing.
Yes. And this book would be very helpful. I'm calling them booklets because I want you to understand they're very inexpensive. And this would be great if you're a parent, obviously, a homeschool parent. Maybe you want to pass one of these on to your Christian school. Maybe even pass it on to some people in the public school and have them remind themselves of that. Tom, you talked about that just a minute ago. Of course, Jimmy Carter started the Department of Education. I would have to say that even before Bill Clinton, there was a little bit with George Herbert Walker Bush that intruded education into that. Then Bill Clinton, then George W. Bush, then certainly Barack Obama. And today it's being reversed a little bit because of an individual that I know you know, who is the Secretary of Education. But the push up until recently has been for greater and greater federal intervention into education. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You go back to 1973, the gentleman named Chester Pierce was a professor in educational psychiatry at Harvard, and he addressed an organization or a gathering of national teachers, and he said at this, quote, "Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is insane. It's up to you, teachers, to make all of these sick children well by creating the international child of the future." Why were they sick? Because they believed in their parents. They believed in the United States. They believed in God. All of these things had to be changed in order for them to get control. And, then they started drilling them on these areas. You have to change the world. You've got to have, areas of healthcare and climate regulation, sexual politics. And they're graded on their activism and their volunteerism rather than their academics. This is what began clear back there. They knew clearly where they wanted to go with it, and now you're seeing the results. As Carol was saying, you're seeing these college students come out. They've been through the whole process, and they have to have therapy and Play-Doh if they see the name Donald Trump written on a sidewalk. This is where we ended up with.
Yeah, the snowflake situation. The other part of this, which I think Tom was talking about, Carol, and you've looked at this as well, it's more affective and it's more away from the basics. We have young people today that if you've ever gone to a fast food establishment and the computers are down, making change is impossible. So just basic math, basic English, if you've ever looked at some of the Facebook posts and things like that. So you say, okay, they spend sometimes 7 or 8 hours in school. What are they learning? Well, they're learning all sorts of things other than the basics, aren't they?
That's right. They're learning how to think a certain way, how to be a good little follower and do what they're hearing from the top to do without questioning. They're the little brown shirts of the future or whatever is what they're training. Instead of teaching them the basics, how to do the math. They don't teach basic economics. And I think that at some point in the very near future, and I'm thinking it and I'm beginning to prepare with materials for it, that churches are going to have to become the educators. Mm-hmm. So that if you don't understand Western civilization, if you don't understand history, American history, and economics and those things, then how can you make a good decision on who you're going to vote for that will represent you in making these policies? And then how do you put things in context? There is no context. They're in a void. Mm-hmm. And so they just go with the thing that sounds and feels good.
Yes. And Tom, that's part of the issue, that feel. I noticed this when I used to speak on college campuses in the 1970s, early 1980s. They'd say, I think, and then I began to hear all of them say, well, I feel. And I began to realize that they were making decisions based on emotion, on those kinds of things that were being taught in the curriculum that had nothing to do with reading, writing, and arithmetic. Is that a fair assessment of what might have changed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you take away reason as a foundation and you put in feelings instead, then you can accomplish anything. You're sitting there looking at a situation and somebody's saying, somebody's got to do something. Well, then somebody logical says, well, yeah, but this is the problem here, that their brains have shut off at that point. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear the emotion. We've got to feel good about what we're doing, and there can't be any negativity involved here. And this is what we end up with.
Let me, just before we take a break, take one call that relates, I think, to Tom DeWeese's comment about Agenda 21. Then we'll get into some of the education questions as well. We're going to get into this idea of an honor project and the Gatekeeper 101. Let me take this one call that relates to Agenda 21 up in Maine, WSEW. Bob, you're on with Tom DeWeese as well as Carol Sewell.
Hi, Kerby. I'll just throw this out. I think Agenda 21 is related a lot to things that are happening in our cities and suburbs as far as property rights, because people that own these condos are subject to all kinds of regulations. They don't have the freedom of use of their property that generally is considered the American dream. And also, I think that the sustainability is carrying over to property uses in the suburbs and the farmlands, as well as with subsidies and so on and so forth. So I just throw that out and I'll listen.
Tom, what's your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. You cannot implement sustainable development policy without first destroying property rights. And as I said at the very beginning, this is about a comprehensive plan to reorganize human society, and private property rights are a major target in that. And if you're going to manipulate people, you're going to eliminate national sovereignty, you're going to have a one-world control, then, you can't have people owning property. If you're going to attack all of our freedoms here, freedom of speech and so forth, well, if you don't have your own property to stand on, it's pretty hard to have freedom of speech. So all of these things are interconnected to reorganize our human society, and private property is number one on it. In fact, let me just share this with you. Just a month or so ago, Mayor William de Blasio of New York City, in a New York Magazine interview, said, "What's been hardest is the way our legal system is structured to favor private property. I think people all over this city of every background would like to have the city government be able to determine which buildings go where, how high it will be, who gets to live in it, and what the rent will be."
Whoa.
Can I be any clearer?
That is such a good quote. We're going to have to put that one up again. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into a little more of this. First of all, let me just mention that Carol Sewell is with, of course, Generation to Generation, and that's real easy to follow. It's G2G, G2G.org. And we have a link there, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this book, What Were They Thinking? On Truth, Liberty, and Legacy, a foreword by David Barton. Also, Gatekeeper 101, which is a supplement to what is known as the Honor Project. And then, of course, we have Tom DeWeese with us as well, and that's an opportunity for you to find the DeWeese report and again, American Policy Center. So we have all sorts of links on the website today, and really encourage you to take the time to find some of these books and resources. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we will also take some more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll talk more about what you can do in your local community and church to make a difference. We'll be right back.
How do we know the Bible is the Word of God and not merely the words of men?
The Bible subjects itself to historical verification. It puts itself at risk of inquiry.
From the American Family Association, The God Who Speaks explores the evidence of the Bible's inspiration and authority through some of the world's most respected biblical scholars.
Just answer the questions that we've had on our heart recently.
Learn more at thegodwhospeaks.org.
Once upon a time, a man sat down before a microphone and began sharing stories, news stories, personal stories, God stories. Hearts and minds were set ablaze. Organizations launched to help others. Teenagers were inspired to become lawyers, even congressmen. People like you who supported Point of View Radio the past 45 years have made that possible. You've made it happen. Yet there are more stories to be told, more hearts and minds to be shaped for the sake of our future. Visit pointofview.net and help amplify this voice with a generous gift. Pointofview.net. Click Donate Now or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Carol Sewell with us in studio, Generation to Generation, G2G.org. We also have Tom DeWeese by phone. And, of course, he is with American Policy Center and the DeWeese Report. I want to get into the Honor Project, Gatekeeper 101, and some great resources you have. But I have one other call I might put towards Tom. Charles, I think you had some questions about Betsy DeVos. Thank you for joining us today.
I did indeed. I am as you guys pointed out, totally disgusted with what they've done, the left has done with the educational system. And when I heard that Betsy DeVos had been installed as Secretary of Education, I thought, oh, this is great. I was elated. And I said, now we're going to see some turning back to what the education in this country ought to be. But so far, I'm not aware of any significant changes. Of course, to be wise, she would do it in a way that doesn't raise a bunch of red flags. So, perhaps that's why I've missed it. But
well, Tom, you know her, so give us a little bit of a background on Betsy DeVos and what you do know.
Well, I don't actually know her. I know of her.
Okay. I thought you'd been together. Okay.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you. I agree with the caller. I'm very disappointed in what's happened so far. There is so much that needs to be done. I think the education issue is probably our most important issue. And, I mean, this is generations of people that are coming through this system and being indoctrinated. And I am not seeing these things being addressed. School choice seems to be her number one issue that she works on. But there are a whole lot of people who aren't in school choice. They're in the public schools. That's where they are. And this is where these programs need to be torn to shreds and begin to replace local control. And she says that Common Core is on its way out and so forth, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. I hope, as your caller said, maybe she's doing things behind the scenes quietly, that this administration has been under such attack that they do have to be careful what they do. I'm having the same problem with Ben Carson at HUD, not moving quickly enough, and these things need to be addressed. So I'm not real happy with where things are at the moment.
Okay. I guess I confused you with somebody that we've had on that did know her, so we'll get into that and maybe find out if we can give people a little bit more understanding. But, the biggest problem, Carol and Tom, was when Ronald Reagan took office, the plan, I remember reading it in the Republican platform, was the dismantling of the Department of Education. But then when they put in Bill Bennett and as secretary, and then the undersecretary is Gary Bauer, we kind of like Bill Bennett. We kind of like Gary Bauer. And so there was a lot less of an emphasis on dismantling the Department of Education, and that, I think, is the ultimate solution. But let's talk about some solutions at the local level. Carol, talk about Gatekeeper 101 and this honor project, because I want some people to understand that there's just a real opportunity for people in their schools, in their churches, in their homes to make a difference.
Yes, there are many ways to make a difference, and one of them is to run for office. And right now we're in the middle of primary season all over the country, and it's so important on who you vote for and that you vote in the primary, because so many people do not, because you get these long lists who are, look, there are 6 people running for this district and House district, and how do I choose? So that's part of the problem. Well, in our county where we live, all of our elected officials are very strong Christians, and we're blessed, and they are very good, and they've gone through, a couple of sessions together. And along with some others in surrounding counties, they formed a group, and they would pray together, and they stood together and voted together, and then, things happen, and people kind of break off here and break off there. So I prayed, and I said, God, we've got these great people in there, but we know what happens. Once they've been in there for 8 years or so, then all of a sudden their voting record shifts a little.
We do see that, don't we?
Yes. And so a few years later, then we're looking at each other, scratching our heads, going, now we need to find someone to run against them because they've gone to the other side. And so as I'm praying about this, because I don't just complain, I ask God, what do we do? How do we stop this from happening? And he gave me the honor project. So and nobody's doing it. So I didn't have any pattern to follow or anyone to ask, how do I do this? But basically, the Lord impressed upon me that if they will stay true to their faith in him and maintain that integrity of their faith and stay close to him, that they will make good decisions on down the line for future generations. Because part of that is getting them understanding that every time they pass a bill, it impacts their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. So it's getting them to think out, not next election.
Think about legacy. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's parents today. We need to think about that, too, what we're leaving our children. So I launched the Honor Project, and the Gatekeeper study, it's a 16-week study,
mm-hmm.
and I wrote it to do with their staffs, because they all have 3 to 5 staff members. They're young people. They're millennials. They're just out of college, or they're interns in college. And so I do this study with them. But because of the Texas schedule, which is so compressed, we don't have time to get together and meet. They just don't have time for that. So I do it through email.
Mm-hmm.
And so I one lesson a week, and then I go down there. I love on them and say, you know, you got any needs that I can pray for you for, and things like that. Just encourage them, because people come in and they're mean to them.
Mm-hmm.
They yell at them and they want something. So I go down and I don't want anything. I just want to encourage and love. And they love that. I always wonder, I'm walking a fine line here that I don't really know what I'm doing. And so I have to be very careful. And so at the end of this last session, my daughter went with me. She'd never been down there. And so her comment was, she said, you know, when you walk in their offices, their faces light up.
Isn't that something?
And I went, okay, thank you, Jesus. That's exactly what I want.
Now, is it possible that other people in other states could do the same thing? Because we broadcast in 42 different states. So it seems to me that this project could be implemented in Tallahassee, Florida, Albany, New York, Sacramento, California, wherever you would happen
Absolutely.
to be located.
That is what I want to do. I see that it can go around. It could be in D.C. They definitely need it there.
Mm-hmm.
But these representatives need to know that there's somebody they can that walks in that they know they can trust, that isn't going to want something from them. I just point them back to Jesus, back to God, to maintain and love on them, encourage them, pray for their families, because you know their families sacrifice a lot. It's not just them; it's their families. So I want to do another Gatekeeper, a second one, finish that out, and try to market this around the country for every state to do. But at the end of the session, see, they don't know there's a book. So I give the book to the representatives. So they go through it on their own. And then at the end of the session, I give them the book. And I tell them, this book is for your library. Never get rid of it. You are to teach your children. We are to teach our children. But if we don't know these things, these principles that the founders so wisely put in place and made this the country that it is, then they can't teach it.
So kind of a re-education project, if you will.
Yes.
And again, information about that on the website, Gatekeeper 101. And Tom, let me come to you for just a minute, because that's why you've been doing the DeWeese Report for years. There are just a lot of great principles that our founders in the 18th century knew, but we've got to bring them back to the 21st century, don't we?
Yeah. They keep talking about the Constitution, that the founders couldn't possibly know the things that we deal with today. Well, it's really funny. The founders understood about greed, and they understood about overreach of government, and they warned us about all these things. So it seems to me they had their finger on it pretty well on what to expect when people get control of the operation of government and the money and that sort of thing, what they'll do with it. It's kind of been, universal from the beginning of, humankind, I think. And so they are, they definitely did know what they were talking about, and the Constitution was put together to protect us from that, and it still is the tool to do that. Our biggest problem is we have so many people in there who do not adhere to it. And they found all kind of ways to get around it so they can keep stuff in their pockets and getting more and more political power. So this is where we have to go. I totally agree with Carol, working on the local level. And this is what we're focusing on as well.
All right, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the other resources. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes we think that the judicial system can and will solve all of our disputes. A recent case from the Court of Appeals of Ohio says there are some things even a court cannot decide. A Roman Catholic institution in Ohio recently dismissed a student studying for the priesthood following an investigation into allegations of moral misconduct. The student, understandably upset, sued the school for breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and other charges. On appeal, the state court in Ohio explained that courts may only adjudicate those matters involving a subject matter courts are authorized to consider. Courts are permitted to evaluate secular disputes, but the doctrine of ecclesiastical abstention prevents courts from settling disputes involving purely doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters. Here, the court explained, all of the claims alleged stemmed from a dispute by a religious organization over matters of church doctrine. Any resolution would, necessarily, require the court to evaluate religious doctrine, a task courts that are ill-prepared to undertake. The judicial system has broad jurisdiction over matters ranging from simple misdemeanors to complex commercial transactions. Yet it is right and proper that courts have limits. The ecclesiastical abstention doctrine highlights those limitations, showcasing along the way the inherent deference that courts have for religious bodies to govern their own religious affairs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Carol Sewell and Tom DeWeese. And Tom, let me, for just a minute, feature your website, AmericanPolicy.org, for people that would like to get the DeWeese Report or get your weekly updates on everything from, we've talked about Agenda 21, we've talked a little bit about climate change and sustainability, we've talked about education, just a few of those many issues you address on terms of individual liberty, private property, free enterprise. Now, you've got a piece there about the Southern Poverty Law Center and a number of others. So talk about what is available when people land on your website.
Sure. Yeah, we have a very extensive archive of articles I've written over the years covering all those issues you mentioned, education, personal privacy, all those kinds of things. And, of course, Agenda 21 and property rights is our main focus. And, it's funny, a few years ago we were writing more and more, putting other stuff out, and people said, okay, I get it. Now what do I do about it? And I jokingly answered, well, I don't know. I never got that far before. And we started to really focus on putting tools together that activists on the local level can use to, help fight back on these issues. We've got a booklet on there, Agenda 21, and how to stop it. We've got a manual that is much more extensive. I have a brand new book ready to come out. It's at the printers right now. The title is Sustainable, The War on Free Enterprise, Private Property, and Individuals, which really covers a whole lot of this. And going along with that, we are in the process of organizing a property rights network of activist organizations, elected officials who are with us on these issues, And we're working to try to bring some legal people in, too. Every day I get phone calls from people saying, help me, what do I do? And I don't have a real satisfactory answer for them. We need a legal team for that, so we're working on that and various other things. So a lot of stuff is percolating at the moment, and we're ready to really launch it here in the next couple of months.
Let's get you on when the book comes out and certainly launch that network as well. When we're talking about manual, another one I wanted to mention, Carol, before we run out of time, is this booklet. Actually, it's more of a book because it's a little bit longer. What Were They Thinking on Truth, Liberty, and Legacy? Forward by David Barton. Now, that's an act of Congress or a grade B miracle because David Barton hardly ever endorses anything. But I go to your website, Generation to Generation, he endorses you, endorses this book. And that really is kind of the manual for what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That was the first book. It's the foundation that teaches God and government. And it's written specifically to Christians who haven't engaged. They're not convinced that they're supposed to engage. And, you know, they basically go to church, sit on the pew, and that's about it. So it's written very easy to understand, everyday language, and it starts with God and government. He instituted government, and then it goes to biblical worldview. What is a worldview? What do you have? And I give some examples so people can judge themselves. Very few Christians have a biblical worldview.
That's true.
It's pretty pathetic.
Yeah.
And then I go into the history. I lay out the real, true Christian heritage of this nation through the writing of the Constitution, the biblical principles, scriptures that are the underlying in each article, and the separation of powers, why it's important, the Electoral College, why it's important, and then just practical application. Okay, so how do I get involved? From my experience, because we've lived in, I've been involved politically in Texas and in California. Completely different systems.
For sure.
And Texas is the best because it's grassroots and it enables everyone to get involved and have an influence, which is great. So I give that and give you direction on where you can go to be educated on issues. What publications are out there that you can subscribe to, organizations you can join, that type of thing. So that's to equip the parents to have that understanding, to begin to engage themselves, and then to bring their children along with them, because they can learn it and teach it, but unless they fully embrace it, the kids won't embrace it. So you set the example for your children and grandchildren. I mean, my grandsons, you know, they think of me, they think of politics, government, and those things. And you don't recognize things. I was at a cabinet forum this week, and one of our county commissioners has an opponent, and the opponent was complaining because the county commissioner is a penny pincher. And our county is the best run county in the state of Texas and maybe in the nation. They get awards all the time. And he was complaining about it because he felt like we could be a little more generous, do things a little bit better, and not be so invisible. Well, if government is good and it's doing what it's supposed to do, it should be invisible.
And that's part of the problem that we have here. Let me just mention the books again. My Kids Belong to Who, which is, again, just a kind of a great, if you will, theology, if you will, of education. So if you really wanted to educate your kids or maybe pass it on to a Christian school, or maybe your homeschool and really kind of want to understand the foundation of education, that is the case. Of course, we've talked about What Were You Thinking, or What Were They Thinking, I guess is the better title. And that is, again, just about the whole foundation of the country. And then this 16-week study, Gatekeeper 101, which is part of the Honor Project, or some of the great teaching. And if nothing else, I appreciate you both allowing me to do an experiment. And when I interview both of you, I think of the two of you. And so I put you together today on the program. But one last time, Tom, let's again talk about what is available, because it sounds to me like you're setting up a network. And so if people say, hey, I'd like to join that network, or maybe I'm a lawyer and I'd like to do some pro bono work, how can they contact you?
Yeah, they can go on the website and sign up for the network there, and we will have more on that in a few weeks as we're beginning to pull all this together. And they can also email me from the website, so they can contact me directly. And yeah, we are putting this together. I don't want to give somebody a new job. We're already busy enough as we are. What I'm trying to do is we have such fantastic people around the country who are working on so many of these issues, and so many of them are working alone, and they begin to get discouraged, obviously. And what I'm trying to do is pull all these really good people together with really good ideas into one big fist so that we can have some impact when these problems arise. One of the biggest problems we have is that these elected officials do these things, and they are surrounded by these non-governmental organizations and federal agents and so forth. They begin to think this is a proper role of government, and they do these things. And one of us shows up, and they think, what? What, are you crazy?
Yes.
This is what we're supposed to do. And we need to make them understand a different way and maybe feel some pain for what they do if they aren't listening to the people. And so that's the point of the network, is to pull this together. We're going to start doing some webinars to teach people in the local level what to do and how to handle things, and bring some really great experts on to share some great information.
And again, we have Carol Sewell in studio, and it's G2G, the number 2, g2g.org. There's a place for the blog, resources. You can find out more about the Honor Project. Go just to the home page there and click on the right-hand corner. It'll tell you about all 4 of the books. We've only mentioned 3 of those today. And Carol, thank you so very much for the work on that. And as we get Gatekeeper, what would it be, 201 or something like that? Whatever, 102, something like that. We'll get you back in here and talk a little bit more about what can happen. And again, if you're in a state and you would like to have something like that happen in your state, contact her as well. So we have links to both these very worthwhile organizations, American Policy Center and Generation to Generation, and appreciate you both being with me today. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to get into another question many of you have been asking about, Bible translation. Bill Mounce with us. This is going to be a great conversation and discussion about how to interpret God's Word. All that coming up right after this.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, from his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters February 16. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of Point of View is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without Point of View, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoint's commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about Bible translation. This is something we've talked about with Daniel Wallace and a few other individuals in studio. And we are just privileged to have in studio with today Bill Mounce. He is the founder and president of what is called Biblical Training. And we have links to biblicaltraining.org as well as to billmounce.org, so you can find that there. Has served on the Committee for Bible Translation and has worked for a variety of those, including NIV and ESV, to mention just a few. Also, of course, has written the best-selling biblical Greek textbook, which is called Basics of Biblical Greek. Has served as a pastor as well as a professor of New Testament and director of Greek language study at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a professor at Azusa Pacific, to mention just a few. And Bill, it's just great to have you in studio with us today.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
Well, first of all, we are thrilled that you're here, but also there was a sense of need. A couple of weeks ago, I don't even think it was that long ago, I had someone call in and say, well, what's the best Bible translation? I'm sure you've gotten that one before.
Yes.
So my answer, and maybe you will agree or disagree, was, well, it depends on what you're looking for, because if you want word for word, New American Standard, ESV is probably more on that end. I said, draw a line. On one line you'd have kind of word for word. Interlinear would be over there, and King James. Then you move over to maybe more phrase for phrase. NIV would probably be in that category. And then all the way over on the other side, would he be like a paraphrase, like the Message or Living Bible or things of that nature? Then we had a number of people call in. I thought, probably would be good to do another program on Bible translation. So it is great to have you in studio. And I guess certainly one of the background questions is, I've talked a little bit about your background. How did you get into this whole area of Bible translations?
Well, not by intention. It's just something that kind of happened. I found when I started teaching, I really enjoyed Greek. Mm-hmm. And so when I was in the college and in the graduate school, I was kind of focusing on that. And I was, in a sense, minding my own business up at Gordon Conwell, running their language program. And the people that started the ESV called and said, would you like to be the New Testament chair? I went, oh, I never thought about that. And so I just kind of came in that door. And so I was the New Testament chair for 10 years. And got out for a couple of years, and then now on the Committee for Bible Translation for the NIV.
And so
but it's mostly just because I really enjoy Greek, and I write a lot about it.
And again, for those of us that don't have maybe a background in Greek, but we have our Logos software or something, we can be dangerous about it. But at the same time, so that people can read the word in their language, this is the great challenge you face, because the Greek language has many words for love, for example. We just have one word for love. I was just in Hungary recently teaching at the Word of Life, and interesting enough, we have words for like and love, but really it's the same word there. So you can see in some languages we have many words, in others we have very few. So this is the great challenge, because word choice, word construction, metaphors, all sorts of things are absolutely essential in terms of Bible translation, aren't they?
Yeah, when I first started in Greek, I naively thought that Greek would just be like a code.
Yes.
So for Bill in Morse code is a set of dots and dashes.
Yes.
And I just thought in Greek it'd be a different set. But the vocabulary doesn't line up, the grammatical structures don't line up, the constructions don't line up, so it always takes interpretation.
It certainly takes some of that. Let me ask the tough question. Of course, one of the tough questions is, what's the best Bible translation? I don't think there's a simple answer to that one. But the question I get from non-Christians or even young Christians is, Why so many translations? I mean, even Muslims use that against us sometimes to say, well, you don't even know what your Bible means because you have different translations. So talk about that for just a minute.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to answer that question. And by the way, the reason there's only one Quran is that early on, they got rid of all the other ones.
That's right.
And
that's
then
true.
enforced one. So that's a slightly different situation. You know, I think there's multiple reasons why people write translations. Basically fall in two camps. There's a whole set of translations that are designed to be basically updates of the King James, Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, the King James, up through that. And they kind of want to stay, and the ESV fits in this camp, wants to maintain a stream throughout all the years. And then there's a whole other set of translations that say, we have a different philosophy and we need to basically start at scratch again and see if there's a way to communicate the gospel in an idiom that really speaks to people today.
Well, and it seems to me that one of the questions that comes from that is, okay, if there are these different translations and maybe even a little different methodology, how different are they? And I've oftentimes said, well, again, I mentioned Logos software, but you don't have that one or something else. Go, if you can, and get one where you sometimes can put a number of translations together. So It seems to me that when you do that, you realize that there are some differences, but they aren't major doctrines usually don't rest on those those differences, right?
Never. I wrote a textbook called Greek for the Rest of Us. When I was done with my main grammar, I wanted to say, well, how can I help people that don't have all the time and energy to learn a language, but can you learn enough about Greek to use the tools intelligently? Mm-hmm. And that was what Greek for the Rest of Us is. And so I've done a tremendous amount of language of translation comparison, and I went in expecting to find contradictions. And that's not what you find. What you find is that translations like the NASB and the ESV will be intentionally vague to reduce the amount of interpretation. And then other translations like the NIV and the NLT will want to help the reader a little more understand what it means. And so you have the love of Christ constrains me. Well, okay, that's vague, and it's either my love for Christ or his love for me. You get over into the NLT, it's Christ's love for me. Mm-hmm. In other words, so one's vague and one's more specific to convey the meaning a little clearer. But they rarely contradict each other. And that's, I think it's really a good thing. A bit surprising, because I know translators are always checking other translations as well.
Yeah.
But it's, there's very few just flat-out contradictions.
Are there any translations you would avoid? The only one I've ever come up with is one by our friends at the Jehovah's Witnesses, because that's just not true to the Greek. Is that fair? Yeah, but are there any others that you would add to that list that you just might really want to issue a disclaimer about?
As you get further and further to that side that you were referencing, where you have the message and that stuff, the problem is what they're trying to do is to help the English reader receive the same kind of impact that the original Greek readers did. And so in order to do that, they have to get more interpretive. They have to add in some more words so the reader gets the same benefit the original readers did. And I understand why they're doing that. And the problem is you just start getting words that aren't in the Bible, and you start getting phrases that aren't actually in the Bible. And so, I enjoy reading the NLT, but there's a lot of extra stuff in there to help people. But when you get out to the message and the original living, there's just, I'm not even convinced that they're Bibles. They're good, they're helpful. A lot of people have really benefited from them spiritually. But people need to understand that the authors are trying to pull them totally into the 21st century. And that just takes a lot of manipulation of the text sometimes.
Good points. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to open up the phones early. You may have a question about Bible translation. We've got an individual that has sat on the committees. Maybe you have a question about a particular interpretation of a verse, or maybe you're just trying to figure out which version or which translation you want to go out and buy after you hear this broadcast. So, again, we're going to give you that opportunity, 1-800-351-1212. We have links to the biblicaltraining.org website and also to Bill Mounce. And so there are some great resources on the website already. But if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Got a lot to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate and discussion about transgender issues will continue because of a transgender ideology that is developed that is actually harmful to kids. That is one of the conclusions of the book by Ryan Anderson with the creative title When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The transgender ideology promotes the opportunity for children to change their gender with surgery and drugs, and parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Ryan Anderson counters that the best studies of gender dysphoria have found that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. He goes on to document that even children going through transitioning treatment still have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts compared to the general population. He reminds us that we should be tolerant and loving towards children and adults who struggle with their gender identity. But we should also be aware of the potential harm when transgender identity is normalized. Unfortunately, we are living in a world where transgender activists want more than tolerance and kindness. They demand affirmation. We aren't allowed to question whether using medical treatments to aid in transgender transformation is positive for children. In his new book, Ryan Anderson shows that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality. As he puts it, biology isn't bigotry. I hope the American people will trust the best scientific evidence and not reject it in favor of the transgender ideology. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13, Samson. In theaters February 16. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Up until about a minute ago, all the lines were full, so I think one caller dropped off. There may be room. No, there is no longer any room. So all the lines are full, so as a caller drops off, you'll be able to join us. And, of course, maybe as we work our way through, some of those calls drop off as well. So I'll let you know when you can call through. But obviously, a lot of people want to ask some questions about Bible translations. And, again, because you have sat on the committee for Bible translation, responsible for these different translations, you've had a chance to see the inner workings. But let me, before I go to the phones, ask just one more kind of obvious question that I run into all the time. That is, some of my friends say, you know, I've gone into like a Barnes & Noble and seen a Jerusalem Bible. Mm-hmm. And it's bigger than my Protestant Bible. It's a Catholic Bible, and it's because it has the Apocrypha. What about that? That's another issue to address in terms of Bible translations, isn't it?
Yeah, the Apocrypha is this collection of books written 200 BC to 200 AD, somewhere in there, that were claiming to be part of the Old Testament, but the Jewish people never accepted them. They're not written in Hebrew. They're mostly in Greek. And because it's the Hebrew scriptures, it's the Old Testament, most people, including Luther, were very content with letting the Jews decide their own canon. And so there's other reasons, of course, but they never made it into the Luther's canon. The thing is that they were in the Septuagint. They were in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the Bible that Paul carried around had them, at least most of them. But it's interesting, it wasn't until the Council of Trent in the 1500s that the Catholic Church actually said these books are officially part of the Bible. So it was in reaction to the Reformation. So yeah, there's depending upon how you count them, 14 to 17 books.
So again, that's one of the questions people have. And our first call has a question about the Hebrew Study Bible. So let's go to North Carolina. Lauren and WLGP, thank you for calling today.
Yes, I was wondering what his thoughts were on the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Study Bible. It not only comes in with the Old Testament, but it's also with the New Testament as well, and I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with that particular edition. I've seen Hebrew New Testaments, which are really helpful in because probably, I mean, everyone back then was bilingual. And so Jesus certainly would have spoken both Aramaic and Greek. And so sometimes you can feel the Aramaic roots behind the Greek. And so it's helpful to see it actually written out. But I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that actual edition.
Well, Lauren, I appreciate your phone call. If we can find out a little bit more, we'll see if we can answer your question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. That opens up a line if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Still processing some of the calls, so I thought I'd ask something else, and that is, many of our people say, okay, I've got a King James Bible. Now they have the New King James. What does that mean? And I think some people understand that what it meant when indeed you had those translators back then. Even if you've ever read Shakespeare, you recognize that English has changed over time and words mean something different. So isn't that at least part of the answer for why you have the difference between King James and New King James?
Yeah, I mean, the New King James was totally a stylistic update. So they accepted the same Greek text. They didn't, as far as I know, change any of the interpretations. It was a mad issue of getting rid of these and thous and just trying to update some of the language so it was understandable.
And it's a little more just than these and thous because some words mean something very different. Every once in a while, we'll be singing an old hymn. Yes, I go to a church that sings some old hymns, and I'm looking at this and going, I am sure these millennials have no idea what that word that we just sang means because it meant something very different even just a century or two ago.
Well, yeah, I still remember being lectured by someone who said that the King James translates love in 1 Corinthians as charity because the nobles wanted the king to have charity toward them. Well, that's not at all what it meant. Charity meant love.
Yes, it certainly did. Well, let's take some more phone calls here. Along the way, we're going to try to answer as many of your questions as possible till we run out of time. We'll go to South Carolina this time, WAGP. And Sandra, you have the floor.
Hey, it's time for me to replace my old threadbare NIV study Bible. And I was wondering what you guys thought of Alistair Begg's new study Bible. I think it has Charles Spurgeon sermons as references throughout.
You know, I'm sorry to swing at a ball and miss it twice. I don't know that, although I really like Alistair Begg, and I have no doubt that his work is extremely good. I mean, he's a wonderful pastor, wonderful preacher.
And we did have Alistair on the program just a couple of months ago. Maybe, Sandra, you heard it. If not, you can do a search on our website. He went through it. Yeah, and it's a very good translation, and it includes a lot of the notes from his sermons and things of that nature. And so he spent an incredible amount of time. So actually, if you'd like to listen to that, just go to pointofview.net. There's a search engine there, and you can actually listen to the, was it a half an hour, an hour interview that we did? But Alistair Begg, I thought, did a very good job and explained exactly how he put that together, working with some of the other translators there.
Does he use the ESV translation in there?
I was thinking he was using Holman. Yeah, I was pretty sure it was a Holman.
Oh, it's Holman. Okay.
Yeah, it was Holman.
All right. Well, it's a good translation.
Glad she knows that because I was pretty sure it was Holman. I wasn't gonna... Yeah, so Sandra, we did cover that with him. And again, I would encourage anybody to go and do that because that just seemed fascinating. As a matter of fact, I've got a copy of the Bible just about 100 yards away, and you open it up and you've got sometimes the handwritten notes there, and then you've got some of it in this transcript so you can see how he preached through some of these various passages. And so I think that would be really helpful to you. So
I would say if you want to stick with the NIV text, and you should pick the study Bible that uses the text you want to use. That's really important. But Donovan has two study Bibles out. There's the old traditional one, and then D.A. Carson came out with one where the study notes are a little more theologically oriented. They're both excellent study Bibles with the NIV text.
D.A. Carson, there's a smart man, isn't there?
Yes, there
Oh,
is.
boy.
Scary. Scary smart.
Scary smart, and we enjoy having him on the program as well. Let's go to some other calls. We'll go to Georgia this time on the Good News Network. Zulma, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello. I just turned the radio on, and I was listening about Bible translations, and so I don't know if he can help me with that one. But I was thinking about Genesis 4:13, where I read Bibles in Spanish, but I do read in English too. And I had a 1909 in Spanish that verse says, "My sin is too great to bear." And then all the other versions that I have in English and in Spanish, they say my punishment is too great to bear. And I'm like, well, to me, your punishment is not too great. You're not dead. You killed your brother. To me, his sin is too great. But I'm like, why? And I looked at the word, and it can be both things. It can mean sin or punishment. And I'm like, well, since he's talking about translations, maybe he'll see. He will know about this one.
Strike three. I'm out. I'm a Greek. I'm not a Greek guy. My Hebrew is not my specialty. But yeah, I think the problem was that what he did was so wrong, and the punishment was going to be so heinous on him that he was afraid he couldn't stand up under it. So if your dictionaries show both sin and punishment as part of the range of the word's meaning, then I think you can pull in both of those ideas pretty easily.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Again, these are opportunities for you to ask, in a few cases, here's some pretty tough questions. When we come back, and we're going to get into a couple others. Some people were wondering about some of the differences, say, between King James and New NIV. Some of you want to know questions about ESV and RSV, so we're going to get into all of those, and all those questions are on the screen. And so if you'll hold off, we'll certainly do that as well. And we'll spend a little bit more time talking about how this committee on Bible translation came together and how some of those translations have been produced. And this is the first time in about 30 minutes here, I would say, just about, that we've had an open line. So if you've been saying, I've been calling, but I'm getting a busy signal, during the break, this would be a good time to get your question on the screen, and then we'll certainly do our best to get your question on the air, and we'll have a chance to hear from Bill Mounce. And again, he is the president of BibleTraining.org. I would encourage you, biblical training, excuse me, my bad, biblicaltraining.org. And, of course, we also have a link to his website, and so you can find out a little bit more about Greek and some of the translations and biblical training and all of the rest. So it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. And if you want to find that interview that we mentioned with Alistair Begg, that's also something you can find at pointofview.net. Just hit the search button, and you can find that as well. If a little bit later you'd like to pass some of this material on to someone else that you know, don't forget that we have a podcast, and so you can download that. And, of course, since he's in studio, you can also go to our YouTube channel. In about an hour, it'll be up, and you can watch it again or send it on to someone that might have some questions you know about in terms of Bible translation. So we'll continue our conversation with Bill Mounce in studio right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour talking about Bible translations, and we are privileged to have in studio with us today the president of biblicaltraining.org, Bill Mounce, with us. He's also, of course, served on the Committee for Bible Translation, served on that for both ESV and NIV. And again, if you're not familiar with all of these, matter of fact, we got all these acronyms on the screen here. KJV for King James, ESV, which stands for English Standard Version, RSV, Revised Standard Version, NIV, New International Version, and on and on. We'll get through all of that before we're through. And we have quite a list of questions. A minute ago, Zilma asked a question of a Greek scholar of Hebrew, but you went back and looked it up. And in Genesis 4:13, let's see if we can answer her question, because it turns out what you said was right.
The verse in the ESV is, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." And the Hebrew word translated punishment means sin, wickedness, iniquity, often with the focus on the guilt or liability incurred. So the word encompasses both the sin and then the punishment for the sin. So she had heard one and then the other, and then it's actually the same concept.
It's one of those few times where it's not an either or, it's a both and.
It's a both and.
Let's go to Nathan in Georgia. I think you had some questions about King James and other translations, so go for it. Thank you, Nathan, for calling today.
Thank you. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. The question I have is, years ago, I was watching a creation scientist, and I cannot remember his name, show where there had been some verses left out of the New International compared to the King James. And I was wondering if that was true, and if it is true, why that would be. And also, a good resource for converting Scripture in King James or whatever translation it may be into Hebrew or Greek, whether it be something on the internet or computer or a book. That's my question.
Okay, some great resources that are available. Go for it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you want to compare Bible translations, Bible Gateway is a phenomenal place to go, and you can pull up different translations and look at them.
And I use that all the time myself.
Yeah.
And Logos software, I use that all the time, and all those kinds of great resources. Yeah,
Accordance as well. So, yeah, very good. Yeah, I'm glad you raised the question about the, quote, missing verses, because this is something that comes up a lot in discussions. And a good example is in John 5, you're reading along, you get verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 5, and you go, where'd verse 4 go?
Yeah.
And I can see why people think that the NIV left it out. Two basic answers. One, this is not an NIV thing. This is a modern translation thing. No modern translation other than New King James that just keeps going what the King James has. They don't have the verse about the angel come down, stirring up the water, and the first person in gets healed. So it's often attributed to the NIV, but it's all modern translations. The basic answer is there's two, real simplification here, but there's two basic sets of Greek manuscripts. And the King James follows one called Textus Receptus, the majority text. And when versification was first started, the first English Bible was versification, I believe it was the Geneva Bible, about 1550. It existed earlier in some of the Greek manuscripts. All those verses existed in that set of Greek manuscripts, and so they all received numbers. Today, every modern English translation follows a different set of Greek manuscripts that are 1,000 years older and we believe much more reliable. And those verses are not in those Greek manuscripts. So it's not that the NIV or any modern translation took them out. It's that they were added later. And so we have really early Greek manuscripts for the verse about the angel coming down. It's not even there.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple hundred years or so after it was originally written, all of a sudden we start seeing those things in the margins, in the sides. And then eventually we see them moving into the actual text. So they had moved into the text when the numbering was done. but we know that they're not original, and so we leave them out. Although it's really important to point out those things are always in the footnotes.
Right.
There's some accusations that, we're leaving out stuff of the Bible. Well, no, we're not leaving out. We're just not adding. And if it's wrong to drop out, it's wrong to add. But there's a real concern on translators that when our Greek texts differ from the Greek text that King James used, we want to honor the tradition. And so that stuff is always in the footnotes. Nothing's being hidden.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a similar question from Jerry in South Carolina, WAGP. So, Jerry, thank you for calling today.
Thank you for taking my call. You answered my second question already, thank you. The first question is I have been told that the millennial translations are not to be trusted. They're too liberal. For instance, I used the 1977 NASB, and I shouldn't trust anything really later than that because they'll, instead of using the generic man, they may put in woman or something like that, or no, if there's supposed to be a gender, it's not translated properly.
Good. Yeah, that's the gender question. I was going to ask that question. So, Jerry, you already anticipated our next question, so let me put that one here. Can we call God our Father, or do we have to call God our person? You know, I guess it's a question that people sometimes hear because it's in the news all the time.
Right,
so, get us some perspective on that.
Well, first of all, as far as God's concerned, he's neither male nor female. He's spirit, but he revealed himself as masculine, and all major translations say he.
Right.
There's accusations that some of the newer translations are, quote, gender neutral, and that's simply not true. Gender neutral means that you are eradicating all gender issues. So when my daughter, who's a PhD student, goes to speak somewhere, her blurb, she has to refer to herself as they.
Wow.
She can't refer to herself as she.
Yeah.
Okay, that's gender neutral. No Bible's doing that. And then there's gender inclusive, where if it's a male and they change it to male and female. And man, there's a little bit of that may go on something like the NRSV, but most Bibles are trying to be accurate. And English is in the middle of this giant sea change when it comes to gender language.
Yes.
And there are places in the United States where he will be heard as male and female. In the majority of the world, that's not the case. And people decry that, but the data is all there. And when most English speakers around the world, India, Africa, everywhere, hear he, they hear male. And so when the Bible says, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, women all go, phew, I don't have to deal with this.
Doesn't apply to me, yeah.
And so what's happening is we know that autophos and anthropos in Greek, brother and man, are used inclusively. They're used of men and women. So the question the translator has to ask is, how do I communicate that?
Especially in other languages.
So it's not like we're adding in woman. When we say if you're brother or sister, we're not adding in sister. What we're saying is Jesus is talking about when you're Christian, what would be the right word? Yeah. When someone in your church sins against you, it doesn't matter what the gender is, you still have to go deal with it. And the question is, how in the culture do you refer to that? And so most translations, even the CSB, says brother or sister sins.
This gives you another feel for what you had to debate there in the Committee for Bible Translation, right?
Right.
Okay, well, you've worked with ESV, and I think I have a question here about ESV and RSV. So let's go to Georgia, WAGP. Ray, thank you for calling today. You're on with Bill Mounce.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen, for your ministries. 2 questions. Do I understand correctly that ESV is a revision of the RSV?
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yeah, they've been upfront about from day one that's what it was. It was an evangelical-friendly update of the RSV.
Okay, that might right there answer my question as to why the former seems to have had the warm reception from evangelicals, where the latter, if I remember correctly, received a cold shoulder.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've seen the contract that Crossway has with RSV copyright holders, and they actually specified in the contract that in Isaiah 7:14 it's going to be a virgin. You know, that was one. Hilasterion is going to be translated propitiation, not expiation. I mean, the contract was really clear that we were evangelicals, and so in Romans 9:5 we're going to punctuate it to call Jesus God.
Yes,
and the copyright holders were fine with that, and they appreciated the money, I'm sure. But it is an evangelical-friendly update of the RSV.
Well, again, that's a question that relates. I better wait to take a break here. We've got someone else wants to talk about some other ESV questions, and so we will get to those in just a minute. And again, I hope you appreciate the fact that we've been able to bring in an individual that has been involved in some of these translations and served on the Committee for Bible Translation, and also, of course, has written the best-selling Greek textbook called Basics of Biblical Greek. And if you'd like to learn Greek, that would be a good way to get started. If you'd like to know more about Bill, you can certainly go to biblicaltraining.org. And, of course, we also have a link to his personal website, so you can learn more about Greek as well. I just saw one of the callers drop off. I think we answered that other ESV question. So when we come back, we actually have some open lines. I'll do my best to try to get in a few more calls, so call right now. If you had a question that you have about Bible translations, we'll certainly give you that opportunity to ask of an individual that has sat on those committees and wrestled with some of the questions which we've just talked about a minute ago. So let's take a break. We'll come back with some more of your comments or questions right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes we think that the judicial system can and will solve all of our disputes. A recent case from the Court of Appeals of Ohio says there are some things even a court cannot decide. A Roman Catholic institution in Ohio recently dismissed a student studying for the priesthood following an investigation into allegations of moral misconduct. The student, understandably upset, sued the school for breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and other charges. On appeal, the state court in Ohio explained that courts may only adjudicate those matters involving a subject matter courts are authorized to consider. Courts are permitted to evaluate secular disputes, but the doctrine of ecclesiastical abstention prevents courts from settling disputes involving purely doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters. Here, the court explained, all of the claims alleged stemmed from a dispute by a religious organization over matters of church doctrine. Any resolution would, necessarily, require the court to evaluate religious doctrine, a task courts that are ill-prepared to undertake. The judicial system has broad jurisdiction over matters ranging from simple misdemeanors to complex commercial transactions. Yet it is right and proper that courts have limits. The ecclesiastical abstention doctrine highlights those limitations, showcasing along the way the inherent deference that courts have for religious bodies to govern their own religious affairs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We'll get to your calls in just a minute, but I also wanted to highlight biblicaltraining.org. Bill, you have a course there, and some people might even want to go there and find out about your course. So talk about that.
Thanks. Yeah, Biblical Training was a project we started in 2000 to get the best teachers in the world out behind the paywall so that everybody could be taught by them. And so there's 110 classes, over 1,000 hours. One of the programs we call is called Foundations, and in there's a class, I actually did it, called Why I Trust My Bible, and it's a slight simplification of a more academic class. But in there's a bunch of discussions about the different questions being raised about the Bible, but there's a big section on translation there. And so if you want to know more about translations and why they're different and why you can still trust them, I encourage you to go to Why I Trust My Bible at biblicaltraining.org in the Foundations curriculum.
Yeah, Foundations curriculum, again, biblicaltraining.org. Of course, we also have Bill Mounce's website there as well. Let's head all the way up to Alaska, KJNP. And Mark, you have the floor. What would you like to ask today?
Hi, Kerby. Thanks for taking my call. And Bill, I appreciate your program and your knowledge. I just was calling in regards to Bible translations. The people that are translating, they have a perspective on, doctrines and particularly minor doctrines, things that aren't, that there may be some controversy on. And so I'm not trying to stir the pot or anything, but in 1 Corinthians 14, for example, verse 1, I've heard a teacher explain that depending on how you take that, if it's in the imperative or the indicative, it changes everything on how you view speaking in tongues, for example. So if it's, the teacher was saying, and I don't even remember who it was, but he was saying something to the effect that 1 Corinthians was an admonishment, Paul's letter to that church in almost every chapter, and that then he addresses spiritual gifts and so forth. Well, I know that there's one camp that they would say, hey, there's 3 different kinds of tongues, and one's a foreign language, and one's something for self-edification, and one is something to edify the church, and that resembles more whatever babbling sounds or ecstatic utterance or whatever. And so what are your thoughts on how translators have a favorite pet doctrines or whatever that they want to translate to kind of support their doctrines in these things, and how do you come to resolve on that? That is it an imperative tone or mode or whatever where it's saying you ought to be doing this, or is it an indicative that this is what you are doing?
Right. There's several really good questions. The general question is a really important question, because I hear this too, that, well, you translators just twist Scripture to meet your own theology, and that's just simply not true. I've sat on 2 major committees. I know most of the translators of the other major committees, and they are good men and women, and they simply don't do it. I mean, I remember being in a discussion, it was on the ESV, in the Romans passage about if you're a Federalist, you believe that you're born guilty of sin. And in Romans, it says, that sin is, it's either translated in whom we sin, meaning in Adam we sinned, or we're sinners because we sin. It's a hard Greek thing. And we voted for because, even though 3 of the translators were Federalists, and they believe we sinned in Adam. And I remember looking at them and going, how about a footnote? I mean, I'm not a Federalist, but what about a footnote for your theology position? They go, no, that's not what this passage says.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, and so I just have seen translators exert a phenomenal amount of caution at doing it, because they all believe the Scripture is from God, and they're not going to mess around with it. But frankly, that's why we have committees. ESV was 12 people. The CBT is 15 people. A lot of advisors and stuff like that. And when you have a wide diversity, and the CBT especially is really diverse. It's someone from every continent except Africa. We're looking for someone. There's men and women. There's just a tremendous amount of diversity. And right at this point, you have to have like a supermajority to change anything. And there's no way that 1 or 2 translators are going to be able to change the NIV.
Very good.
Yeah.
I might just mention earlier, we had Sandra asking about the Spurgeon Study Bible and Alistair Begg, and I looked it up just in case anybody's looking for it. The interview we did was on November 13th, and so if you'd like to know more about the Spurgeon Study Bible, there's the case.
Yeah. Hey, to your other question, I checked 1 Corinthians 14 when you said it, and this is one of the few occasions where The imperative and the indicative are the same form in Greek. It's about the only place that it happens. My position on that is I don't like 1 Corinthians 13 being the love chapter, and that puts me in a real minority. But I think what Paul is doing, he's talking about the disruption in the Corinthian church, and he gets to chapter 13 and says, look, that's not the way love is. Yeah. Love is patient. Come on, guys. Love is kind. Yeah. And I think he's beating a drum in 13. So when I get to 14:1, pursue love. I think contextually it has to be an imperative.
I wouldn't put the chapter division there, but that goes back to another bugaboo you and I have.
Well, have you seen those new Bibles that the readers are coming out where the verses are removed? And it's wonderful. It's a totally different reading experience.
I think so. I would agree with that. We haven't mentioned the Net Bible, and it looks like Adam in California wants to bring that up. So, Adam, thank you for calling in today.
Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate it. The Net Bible is not really one that I've really heard a lot about, but I've kind of grown to appreciate over the last few years. And then even more recently, the Christian Standard Bible and the one, Alistair Begg, that you were talking about, I know that it comes in the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. So I've really grown to appreciate both of them. I've found myself using the Christian Standard Bible even more recently for my reading. But I just wanted to I like to have an open ear to I don't know, just the things to watch out for, or if things are good or whatever. Yeah. So I just want to get your input on both those translations.
Yeah, and I just spent 3 days speaking at Dallas Theological Seminary, and the Net Bible was done mostly by DTS professors, so I've been talking about it. Both those translations are very good. The Net Bible started, I don't know if people know the origin, but Joe had wanted a Bible he could give away on the internet.
Yes.
And couldn't get the publishers to do it, so he said, well, phooey with this, I'm just going to
make my own. Yeah.
And what's remarkable in that Bible, that it's done by a bunch of DTS professors who are dispensational in their theology. It doesn't read dispensationally. I mean, it just doesn't. Mm-hmm. And it's a very good translation. What I love about the Net are the notes. There's just so many of them.
Extensive notes.
61,000, something like that.
Yes.
But the notes are really, really helpful at a translation level to know what's going on and why they did stuff. That's really good.
Yeah.
The CSB, the revision of the Holman Christian Center Bible, likewise is a very interesting translation because it's a little more word for word. They didn't think in terms of word for word, but it is a little more word for word, but they handle the gender issue differently. And so here's a Bible that reads a bit like the ESV, but it'll say if your brother or sister sins against you. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch how people receive it. Both are very, very good translations.
Bill, I wish we had more time because we have 1 or 2 calls left, but we've done a pretty good job. I think we've covered 9 or 8 calls, so that's been pretty good. And I appreciate you being willing to take all the questions from a variety of different angles, and thank you for your service on the Committee for Bible Translation. Sounds like you have a lot more work to do, so it's just been great to have you in studio with us today.
Thank you very much.
As we said, some of you have been asking about Bible translations, and so we wanted to bring one of the best in studio today, and of course tomorrow we'll have our weekend edition. Of course, we've had the shooting in Florida. That will be a primary topic, but we wanted to educate you today about the Bible. Find a good translation, read it every day, apply it to your lives. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow on our weekend edition.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges. From his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters February 16. More information is available at samson.movie.